Let's take a look at MicroStrategy stock. I did make a video in the past about this particular stock, so I wanted to give an update. But in the previous video, we drew in this parallel channel and we said, price is probably likely to at some point come down to this kind of level around $100 or so. And quite impressively, price did actually come down right to this level, tagged it, and has now reversed higher. So if you want to be bullish on MicroStrategy, this is kind of a great sign, actually. It shows that, as with parallel channels, you often go to the top, then the bottom, then the top, then the bottom, and then potentially then again to the top. Now, that would be the bullish look on the stock. I do have some other charts that are also quite bullish for MicroStrategy, but we have to keep in mind that if the 4-year cycle was to play out in the same way that it did previously, the typical timeline is for Bitcoin to have its final bottom a little bit later on in the year, not just yet. So my expectation is not even necessarily that you'll get down to sort of $90 or so on MicroStrategy. I could sort of imagine you actually put in some kind of a double bottom similar to how you had in the previous bear market for MicroStrategy. Perhaps we're going to come down again to this sort of level, maybe a tiny bit below that, $100 or so. I think that would be a really decent place to, again, enter a long position. And I think that would be, if you had some period of chop and perhaps, at some point, we're going to crash down here, maybe when the market also corrects as a whole, that might be a really good place to then build a base and recover in the long term for MicroStrategy. So I would imagine that actually this low here probably marked some kind of actual low on the price. I would imagine if you did buy in here, you're probably not going to experience much of a drawdown, even if the bear market does extend and ends up being as long as it usually is. Of course, the trend is still bearish, so I would expect some period of consolidation around these sort of levels before then reversing the trend and once again going higher. I don't expect MicroStrategy to be a buy for quite some time. Typically, we've had buy signals in the period just before you get these massive up moves on MicroStrategy. So I am waiting personally to be a buyer once we see that. But you could imagine that the lows will already have been set by the time that the buy signal and the trend change has actually arrived. So in my view there, you did quite quickly come down on MicroStrategy, find a bottom, and actually that remained the bottom for quite some time. Now, it did mean, the bear market lasted a long time, and you did come back down to those sort of levels. If we just zoom in on the chart, this is how it would have looked in the previous bear market. You did have a sort of double bottom. So I'm expecting there might be something similar play out here. You might even get a bigger recovery rally as well as you did previously have before maybe a double bottom. Now, of course, history doesn't have to repeat, but to me, that's looking like quite a possibility, and I've got some other charts that support that view. So let's have a look at those now. So the first one here is MicroStrategy over the S&P, and you can see here this big parallel channel should be providing some kind of support on this ratio. We did actually drop quite far below it and ended up using it as resistance. We have now climbed back into the parallel channel, so that's quite bullish actually. If you can hold these levels and go higher on this ratio, then perhaps that could be again a signal that the low in terms of absolute MSTR price is maybe in on some level, or there might be a second low at a similar level coming down the line. But compared to the S&P, which might actually experience a bit of a correction going forward, then you could see the outperformance on MicroStrategy, from this point onwards, presuming it doesn't go down below sort of the levels it was at previously. So this is quite a bullish sign to me. Another point in favor of the argument that I was making there. And a very similar chart with the QQQs, perhaps a little bit better of a chart because, you just wicked down below these sort of levels before regaining them quite quickly. So a bit more of a convincing chart here, MSTR compared to the NASDAQ, and I think this could signal some outperformance. So how this is looking to me is probably, since you've had such poor performance from Bitcoin, crypto, MicroStrategy already, probably a lot of the pain is already in. Now, there might be another washout, but that's probably going to coincide with the markets in general tanking. And if that's the case, then this ratio won't collapse further, I don't imagine. So my base case would maybe you get, back to this level again, just retest it once more. That's probably the worst case, how I see it, compared to NASDAQ, adding credence to the idea that perhaps some kind of a local low has been set on MicroStrategy. And another chart. This chart's really interesting. This is MicroStrategy over the money supply, now arguably very, very similar again to the previous two charts we just looked at, but another chart that sort of gives us confluence with the idea that potentially the stock has found some kind of a bottom on these important ratios. Depending on how we draw this, perhaps it wicked through here. Perhaps we could technically redraw it like this, and perhaps then you're going to have some further downside coming. That is something to consider, certainly. And in that case, it would look like a potential of maybe a 30% underperformance compared to the money supply expansion that's ongoing. So basically how much money there is floating around. But this is quite a promising sign in my book. I think it is possible that this ratio is also bottomed. Might not have, but that's going to sort of depend on how things are looking. But I could imagine a scenario where you get increased liquidity coming, and MicroStrategy maybe does come down a bit again, but then will eventually reverse and have its outperformance. So basically all of these charts are leading me to believe that I don't think you're going to revisit the bottom of this channel and go as low as $90. It's possible. I think it's more likely that this is sort of a pretty decisive low that's been set, which we may come back down to just to test in the future. And that would be my base case at the moment on MicroStrategy. So I'm not quite a buyer just yet, but if I were to see some negative price action in the months coming, then I would actually strongly consider buying into MSTR, Bitcoin, crypto in general. One more interesting chart I have for you, by the way. MicroStrategy over BMNR, the Tom Lee treasury company, BitMine, of course, looks to be in some kind of an upwards parallel channel. So this is actually quite bullish if you're a MicroStrategy fan over BitMine, and I wonder if this outperformance is coming as a result of the stretch dividend paying fund that you can buy from MicroStrategy, which is sort of allowing them to buy more Bitcoin. I wonder if the outperformance is going to be a result of that and the sort of snowball effect of that, compounding their ability to buy more Bitcoin compared to Tom Lee and BitMine, which have not pursued such a strategy of, leveraging up their balance sheet. So you might have outperformance on MicroStrategy compared to BMNR, which I think is very interesting because for quite some period of time, and already there has been quite some outperformance actually from these particular lows. But you've tagged the bottom of this parallel channel. So again, on the relative valuation, we may be again coming up to the top at some point. So reason to be sort of a MicroStrategy bull over BMNR, and usually with the Bitcoin cycles, it tends to be that Bitcoin outperforms at first, and then perhaps you get an altcoin, Ethereum, and all the rest of the coins, outperform after that. So some interesting thoughts here, I think. Certainly going to be an interesting time going forward. The next few months, I think there might be some really good opportunities in the crypto markets and things like this. So I'll be keeping my eye out for any buy signals on the indicator. Of course, we're still a little bit a ways from that, but we'll keep you guys in the loop. So make sure you subscribe to stay in that loop. Thanks very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.